This is the Fresh Start Project, where we explore the growing loss of trust in social institutions and how we can break free from broken systems and move forward towards something better. I'm Christian Mislewick, and with me today is Donald H. Ruggles. Don is an architect and the CEO of Ruggles Mabe Studio, a full-service architecture and an interior design firm based in Denver, Colorado. He is the author of Beauty, Neuroscience, and Architecture, and co-producer of the documentary Built Beautiful, which is based on the book. The film explores the growing body of neuroscience research that links beauty to human well-being and what these findings mean for the future of architecture. Don, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored to be with you today.
Thank you so much too. So I watched Built Beautiful. It's available on Amazon Prime Video, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in art, architecture, traditional urbanism, and even neuroscience. One goal of this channel, what I'm doing here, is to identify the many ways that the modern world is making so many people sick, unhappy, unfulfilled, and often without them realizing it. And one factor of modernity that I believe most people don't even consider is the lack of beauty in our built environments, the places where we work, live, shop, our towns, our cities, our suburbs. And that's why your documentary, it's so important. It's calling attention to how aesthetics affect our neurology, our overall well-being. So to begin, I'm wondering if you can walk us through a little bit how our environment affects us on a neurological level.
It really seems like it's quite fundamental when you say, well, our environment affects us biologically. And when you make the statement, well, of course it does. I mean, how can it not? Mm-hmm. And so we've been looking at just exactly what is that biological reaction? What initiates it? And it's pretty fascinating, actually. Most of it happens subliminally without our knowledge. 95% of the neurological inputs that are received or provided by our nervous system are processed subliminally. And mm-hmm. So clearly it is controlling our lives, if you will. And our brain is the greatest surveillance device, if you will, ever imagined. Mm-hmm. I mean, always looking out for your survival. And so there are many kind of threat assessments that are happening with your brain. And if there are too many of them, or the threat assessment is too acute, then it can lead to fight or flight response, which is a survival response. And survival is counteracted in our neurological system by a pleasure response. Now, the survival response tends to be, most scientists estimate, 5 to 7 times stronger than a pleasure response, because our body wants to protect us first before seeking any kind of pleasurable situations. Mm-hmm. So the neurological response that we get from a survival response is leading to health ramifications of elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, downregulates the immune system, and injects hormones into your system that are generally not good for you. In the short term, they are, because they provide for your survival. Mm-hmm. But if it's chronic and it continues to happen over and over, even it's not episodic, it's chronic, continuous, then that's where the problem is coming in. So we've found that the geometry that we've been using in the past 100+ years architecturally is actually creating a stress response. Mm-hmm. And it's really fascinating. I think the geometries that are used in architecture and even interior design, and that have been taught for over the past 100 years, it's part of our educational system. So these are geometric patterns that aren't necessarily comfortable for the general public. So architects and designers, while comfortable viewing them and responding to them in an intellectual way, they that we're not addressing the general needs of the general public in terms of health and well-being. So I think there's needs to be a reassessment of how we're teaching architects, the patterns that we're teaching them to use, and what are the biological and psychological ramifications of the geometries that we're using. And it's absolutely, you know, fascinating and profoundly important. There's a quote in the lecture that I give pretty often, and that quote is, architects and designers have a greater opportunity to affect public health than medical professionals, given the new science. This is, you know, a sea change shift for responsibilities of architects, that we, by utilizing certain design patterns, we can actually affect proper health and well-being. It's pretty remarkable.
The neuroscience research that's coming to light, becoming popularized thanks to your documentary and to other speakers, and also this growing field of neuro-aesthetics, it should be paradigm shifting, because if we can tweak the way people feel on the inside, what their actual biological reactions are to how they live, how they're walking to work or to the store, and it's filling them with cortisol or some sort of fight or flight response, then it's really selfish, harmful, self-indulgent to design an environment in a way that provokes that.
Well, we have the information to be better, you know,
Right.
and this information is just coming to the surface. So I don't think architects have set out to create harm in the public
Sure.
realm. But now we have new information that I think needs to be, you know, disseminated into the profession, and including interior design and urban planners as well. That, you know, this is information that we can use to make our product better and healthier for the people that are going to engage with it. And this goes all the way down to house design, to up to massive urban design.
Right.
And the scale really doesn't matter. It has more to do with creating a geometric pattern or set of patterns that a general public can respond affirmatively and positively to. Now, you've mentioned the word beauty a few times, and that's, of course, in the title of my book. That's a lightning rod word. It has been in art and architecture for 150 years or so. And when it was first postulated in the 1800s that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that has held firm now for, as I just said, over 150 years. That is shifting to the notion that beauty is in the brain of the beholder. And it's actually, some aspects of beauty we're born with, literally resides in our DNA, because it's passed on, part of our genetic inheritance. It's passed on from generation to generation through our DNA, and it's part of the evolutionary history that humans brought with them as we evolved from being quadrupeds to bipeds to hunters and gatherers and living on the savannah over millions and millions of years. And so our neuroscience are starting to uncover aspects of beauty. And I think another word I like to use to substitute for beauty, which I think brings a little more clarity, and it's part of the neuroscience definition, is pleasure. So, and our neurology separates the nervous system inputs into our brain into two categories automatically, and just two, and survival and pleasure. And and now there are gradients of it. So there are extreme threats and mild threats and extreme pleasure and awe, and then more mild, subtle pleasure. So that is, I think the biggest revelation for me when I started down this path back in 2008 and 9 was that beauty is actually a physical response that you're having subliminally. You're not even aware of it, to a pattern that you recognize as being not a threat and has qualities of being familiar and has the potential for pleasure. When those three things happen, then you're going to neurologically relax. There's a sense of, oh, good. Okay, think of looking at a field of flowers. Okay, there's no threat there. Probably a distant view to rolling hills, clouds, birds, flowers. No, there's no threat there. So there's relaxation that's happening neurologically. This is why we create parks, so people can remove themselves from threat and stress situations and go to relax. So think again, back to the field of flowers. Now imagine that same field of flowers with a large python snake in it. So it changes your whole perception and preparation to deal with the situation. The relaxation's gone, and now you're dealing with, okay, what avoidance do I have to take to protect myself from this threat situation? So back to this notion of beauty being a physical response, we have really three components of our brain. This is long-held theory about brain anatomy. There's some new ideas coming out, but I'm going to focus on this older kind of more widely embraced theory about the brain, that it's in three parts. And it's the ancient brain, which is at the base of our cranium, and the midbrain, which is the limbic system. And those two portions of the brain evolved with humankind over tens of millions of years. Then the modern brain, over the past 4 or 5 million years, started to develop. So when you look at a picture of a brain having been removed from a corpse, you'll see the articulated kind of a tissue mass that wraps over the ancient brain, and it's that kind of wavy gray matter. And that's known as the modern brain. Well, neurologically, what happens is the ancient brain is notified of incoming inputs from our nervous system. And then if it needs to be processed by the modern brain, then it's pushed on to the modern brain, and that becomes a feeling. And the first processing is known as an emotion. It's going through the limbic system, and then it pushes into the modern brain, which becomes a feeling. And feeling, that's where we have to pay attention as architects, because when those subliminal inputs come up from the ancient brain and go into the modern brain and becomes a feeling, then that's what architects need to be aware of. Now, corresponding with survival and pleasure is avoidance, of course, which would be attached to survival, and approach, which would be attached to pleasure. So what we're looking at as architects is the important component of, well, every pattern you use either creates an approach or an avoidance reaction. Mm-hmm. And a couple of phrases I use in my lecture is, no doubt you have rooms or buildings that you go out of your way to see. And perhaps you'll say, I just love it there. I don't know why, but you just love it. Well, that's a subliminal response becoming an approach feeling. Conversely, you might say, you might have buildings that you go out of your way to avoid. Well, why? Or you may make the statement, I don't feel like going there anymore. I can't put it into words, but I just don't feel like being there. Well,
Mhm.
that's an avoidance reaction. And again, that's a subliminal emotion turning into a feeling that is becoming physically initiated avoidance. So this is profound for architects. Our buildings create avoidance, survival reactions, or um, approach pleasure reactions. And once you start to consider that, then you realize the importance of balancing our nervous system and what are the components and the geometric ideas that support general approach for the general public. So often architects will go, well, I just love that building. That's amazing. Well, that oftentimes is the modern brain, the executive thinking overriding the emotional brain. Now, that push and pull goes on all the time. It's called bottom-up processing versus top-down processing. And that is happening every second of every day. The modern brain, you might, again, going back to my example, I don't feel like going there. Oh, well, let's go ahead and go there. And then you go there and you don't feel so good. So then the ancient brains won out over the modern brain. So it's just absolutely remarkable that and you drill back down and you go, okay, well, this is all being initiated by the geometric patterns that we are using as architects. And it's initiating this pleasure or survival response. And there are many, many health ramifications on both sides of the equation, positive and negative. And there's a statement by a research architect with HKS, Erin Peavy, and she states that no design is neutral. It either creates a plus for our health or a minus. And heavens, this is pretty remarkable information. So these are long answers. I'm sorry, I've kind of
No,
rambling on here.
that's
So,
exactly the foundation we need.
okay.
It's interesting because you've said this word pattern several times, that there are patterns that produce that pleasure principle or that survival reaction. So I'm wondering if we can discuss what some of these patterns are and what the evolutionary basis is. I mean, you mentioned we evolved on the savanna. When I spoke with Ann Sussman, who also talks about the uh, biology and neuroscience of beauty, she said something very interesting in your movie, but also something similar when I interviewed her. We didn't evolve to live in buildings. When we are born, it's an environment that's actually alien to our DNA, what material we bring with us when we enter into this planet. So
Exactly.
can you tell us a
Well,
little bit about what material we have and what we're looking for in a pleasure inducing environment?
um, so we postulate there are three pattern types that humankind evolved with. One are fractals, which are patterns from nature. And Nikos Salingros has written and researched this extensively, the mathematical components. Fractals are mathematic analysis of patterns, geometric patterns that occur in nature. And so patterns in nature would be one pattern that we evolved with. Before there were ever buildings, we were looking at flowers and trees and rock formations um, and other animals. So patterns from nature would be one. The second one would be curvatures from the human body primarily, but just general anatomy from the animal kingdom.
Yeah.
And
There's this
that,
term zoomorphism, and for patterns based on animal shapes, and I think
yes.
for flowers as well.
So good, that's a good term and a good research topic. So that would be our second pattern schema that we should, look at and embrace. And the third is a little more specific, but it's profoundly important for humans, and that would be the facial pattern,
Yes.
which is a 3x3 pattern, otherwise in architecture known as 9 square, which is quite well known through the history of Greek and Roman and Western architecture. Also, turns out Oriental architecture. So the 9 square ends up being a fundamentally important pattern. And we have remarkable ability to discern faces and remember the subtleties of facial patterns. But when a child is born, 65% of the neuronal structure of a newborn is dedicated to face recognition. And Darwin theorized that a child has to find a face when they're first born. They can't take care of themselves. And it's not just the immediate needs when at birth, but thereafter for several years. And so the bonding that happens between caregiver and child gazing into the mother's face, the love and empathy and nurturing and just general bonding that happens initiates the reward pathway circuitry in our brain. And so what happens, and this isn't my theory, there's scientists have written about this, is that when we see that pattern, not just looking at your mother's face, but when we see the pattern in the US Capitol building or in Palladio's building or in other famous historic structures around the world, when we see that, it subliminally initiates the reward pathway and puts feel-good hormones into our body, which downregulates our stress, improves our health and well-being, and makes us feel well. And that's actually why we go out of our way to see Notre Dame, the Taj Mahal, the US Capitol building. Think of the iconic, famous buildings around the world that people take vacations just to go see because it makes them feel well. And so, and it's the power of this pattern. And oftentimes, Notre Dame's a good example, probably the best 3x3 pattern. That pattern steps down from large scale to mid scale to small scale over and over and over. And that's when the strong reinforcement starts to happen. And the proclamation it's beautiful because you're feeling, the strong rush of hormones because your subliminal brain is recognizing the pattern as being pleasurable, non-threatening, and somewhat familiar. And so Palladio's buildings, there have been famous buildings recently, but Fallingwater is a muted 3x3 pattern. Frank Lloyd Wright used the 3x3 a lot early in his career because he was schooled by Louis Sullivan, but he continued to use it in subtle ways all the way through, including the Guggenheim, which has a left, center, right, and a top, center, bottom. So it's just, once you start to see it and recognize that this pattern can initiate a pretty strong subliminal response, and it's not hard to do. I gave a TED talk recently, and I told the audience, look, you can go home and create the same pattern in your house right now with a hammer and a picture hanger. So if you hang 2 photos symmetrically above your fireplace, that becomes a 3x3 facial pattern. And so moments of nested symmetries like that, like your fireplace and even the master or the primary bedroom the headboard wall of your primary bedroom can be a 3x3 pattern. And so you use those nested symmetries over and over, not on every wall, but maybe once in every room. Now you're starting to generate rest and relaxation neurologically, which will help the occupant's health and well-being.
Nested symmetry, can you define that?
Excuse me?
Nested symmetry?
So in an overall, let's say you have a large scale wall, but within it is a smaller facial pattern. So it's nested within a general field of information.
I see,
So,
the wall.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or the building facade. I mean, the word facade is face. So it's, so nested symmetries, organized complexity, that's a really, really, great term that's being used quite a bit recently. I think Nikos and Alexandros Labdas, neuroscientists, have been looking at that pretty extensively as this organized symmetry concept, organized complexity, excuse me, and nested symmetries. And so for an environment, and let's just talk about the inside of a building. Every wall doesn't have to be symmetrical. That's boring. And boring is not good either, because the brain needs stimulation. And again, back to this push-pull between top-down and bottom-up processing. Your brain is constantly exercising itself and keeping itself healthy. And so you need some stimulation, but also you need rest and relaxation. And the two balance each other out. And that balance point is known as homeostasis. So the homeostasis is considered by some healthcare professionals as the single most important factor for a long-lived life. And that means balance in your nervous system. And the Zen philosophy, certain Buddhists have been practicing it for thousands of years. But we're starting to look at it more from the neurological side. And then how does it play into architecture and design? Right.
That brings up a really interesting point about the traditions that seem to be reinforced by the neuroscience. I think in the film, it's said that the traditional architects, the people who were building the cathedrals or the very aesthetic buildings that people flock to in droves to visit as tourists, those designers seem to intuitively understand beauty. But now with the neuroscience, it's creating this a body of research that supports why exactly empirically from a scientific standpoint that it produces that response. So it's funny how these two different schools, perhaps like the more liberal artistic and scientific, are working in concert to say much of the same thing.
So, there's a big push and pull between traditional architects and modernists. And modernism has, built amazing buildings around the world, and we're, trying to keep up with the expansion of humankind population-wise. So there have been building techniques that evolved so we could build fast and efficiently. And traditional architecture seems or tends to be looked at as slow and old and just reaching back into the past. But traditional architecture actually evolved over such a long period, and it was intuitive responses to how people felt. So the traditional buildings that have lasted and the models that have been repeated were models that people responded positively to. And
there's a survivorship bias. The ones we like the most survived.
Exactly. So I think, the point that we're trying to make in the movie, and that I stress in my lecture, is your brain doesn't care what style the building is. It only cares, can I find the nested symmetry? Or can I find a fractal? Or can I find, some curvatures that I respond positively to that reflect my familiarity, my ancient familiarity with the animal kingdom. So your brain doesn't care whether it's de Stijl or Gothic or modern, or has no absolute, why? what it cares about is its survival. And it's trying to find situations where it can feel rest and relaxation so it can balance its nervous system, counterbalance against all the stress, traffic noise, bad smells, uh, noise, going off in the background that you don't know what it is, people approaching you, you don't know if it's a threat or not. And I mean, it's just life tends to be quite stressful now. And so we're constantly looking for ways to achieve rest and relaxation. And it's that's why our homes are so important. They should be a refuge, a place for rest and relaxation. So if you use the right set of patterns in your house, then you're likely to improve your ability to feel rest and relaxation, and therefore improve your health and well-being.
Going back to this idea of traditional architecture versus modern architecture, I mean, when I spoke with Anne, we discussed the foundations of the modernist movement, starting with the Bauhaus designers. Why do you think a lot of their work seems to miss the mark when it comes to what the neuro-aesthetics is telling us in terms of what people want in a building?
So your question is, why do I think the modernist work is missing the mark in terms of creating health and well-being?
Yes, because I would argue that modern architecture is not beautiful. Um, what architects might think is interesting, because I think they're a culture to it and they're in the classroom. It's not necessarily what people want.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And I think that's one of the points we're trying to stress. And I work a lot with Anne, so when we compare notes a lot. The Again, it comes back to the geometry that we're utilizing. Now,
Yeah.
early on, Mies van der Rohe was trained as a traditional architect, as was Le Corbusier, and even Walter Gropius. So they tend to be the three-legged, tripod that modernism has stood upon. And they then, as things loosened up and things went faster and faster, we started to lose the foundations that we were really had built contemporary architecture on during the 15, 16, 17, 1800s. We started to discard those. So it was more free and open and positive, and let's change this and let's do this, and forgetting the intuitive notions that supported architecture that was pleasing, and more focused on intellectual aspects of architecture. So the idea and the story became more important than the subliminal feeling, the emotion. So I think what's important to realize is that Gropius and Mies, I mean, Mies's work has a lot of 3x3 components to it. Even Corbusiers' Ronchamp is you distill it down and it's a 3x3 pattern. It has a left, a center, a right, and a top, and a center and a bottom. Now it's distorted, but nevertheless, it's there. And so you can easily kind of project yourself into it and approach safely. And so I think the point that we need to make here is that the geometry that we're using, if we can just steer it back towards more fundamentals so that we create more centered design. Many of the projects that I see come across my internet feed, it's just there's no center to them. And so we're used to looking at the facial pattern, which of course has a center. And so when we don't see it, then, and this is Anne's work with eye motions, eye tracking and face recognition science. is that when we don't see that, then our eye goes on to something else. And if we're forced to look at it, then that being forced, so you're stopping to look and try to process it and figure out what it is, well, that's called stress, because
Mm,
the brain doesn't like to do that. The brain doesn't have enough energy as it is to process all the inputs coming in. Well, let's see, 11 million bits of information a second are being pushed into the brain, and only 50 of those become feelings. So it's having to use up a lot of energy to process all of this incoming information, and it does not like to stop and figure things out. It likes to categorize things into patterns, and that's called learning. And so that you can have efficient neurological processing. And when that happens, you rest, and you have rest and relaxation.
mm,
So,
yeah. Anne had an interesting slide that she shared. She had done an experiment where she asked designers from around the world. She had a pretty good representative sampling of people, and she asked them to draw a house as if you were 6 years old, and they all had that very the figural primitive. It was like the face, the windows as eyes, the door as a mouth, capped with the gable, roof, and chimney.
that's their mother's face they're drawing.
Wow, wow.
So,
It's funny because we talked about the Bauhaus movement. I have perhaps Tom Wolfe. Perhaps you've
yes.
read this. Yeah,
Oh,
it's
yes.
yeah, it's funny because just take the example of a roof that we just discussed how most people associate a house, the hominess, with that pointed gable. Uh, to the Bauhaus movement, they were moving away from the European tradition, and a roof was a symbol or decoration of a crown, and so they were intellectualizing their architecture and moving away from these symbols of the ancient regime. And it's just fascinating to me.
Absolutely.
You can't blame them though, because I think perhaps
No.
they thought that what the
Oh,
European tradition produced was war, the great wars that they survived.
no kidding. World War One was, they had to rebuild quickly after World War One, and then the horror of World War Two came along, and it just further cemented this idea. Let's do things differently so we don't end up in these same spots again. And I
Certainly.
think, we have now, and I think we've learned a lot of lessons from it. Then we can use those lessons to go forward and make things better.
Yes.
So,
They were trying to rebuild not just the Bauhaus movement, architects in general after World War One, World War Two, and they had this advantage at that moment in human history. They were inheriting the recent industrial revolution, so they could rebuild cheaply and on a mass production level. But
exactly.
we lost something though from the past.
Exactly. I thought John Simpson in our movie really summarized it early in the movie really, really well. We lost all the techniques that had evolved over thousands of years, um, in an effort to speed construction up and cut cost and all the necessary things that were required to rebuild Europe. And those notions then came over here when Mies and Gropius primarily came over and founded the architecture, not founded, but kind of took control of Harvard and Illinois. So architecture schools. So it's we've had amazing construction, some amazing projects have been built. I think some that I would cite as being especially kind of respectful of these patterns. Fay Jones' Thorncrown Chapel, that's a remarkable. Lloyd Wright's Wayfarers Chapel in California is another one. Calatrava's work tends to be, so exuberant, but nevertheless, it usually has a center
Mm,
and a left, a center, a right, and a top, and a center, and a bottom. and there are patterns in there, fractal patterns that you recognize. He often uses animal forms to help kind of formalize his geometry. So Richard Meyer used the 3x3. Louis Kahn, you know, so that famous courtyard at the Salk Institute. So, you know, people walk around the corner and stand in the center and look out at the ocean, and they're mesmerized. It's magic. And why? Well, because you have a building on the left, the plaza in the center, and a building on the right. So you have a left, a center, and a right.
Mm.
And the top is the sky, the middle is the ocean, and the bottom is the plaza level. So you basically have that intuitive 3x3 pattern that,
Yes.
and people just stand there and are mesmerized because the changes in the ocean and the sky and in the clouds and, you know, the birds coming by. These are all sending continuous approach pattern neurological inputs.
Right.
It's called parasympathetic, by the way. It's autonomic nervous system. And sympathetic is the counteractive force to parasympathetic. So sympathetic is survival inputs, and parasympathetic are pleasure inputs. And it's the subliminal nervous system, which is known as the autonomic nervous system.
When you mentioned the 3x3, it strikes me as what photographers teach when they're setting up a well-framed photograph.
My iPhone camera, I get ready to take a picture and a 3x3 grid comes up.
Yeah, it's like that tic-tac-toe pattern. Yeah.
Oh, listen, Apple knows all about what I'm talking about here. Their whole gestalt is built on approach and hunter-gatherer notions of touch and feel and ownership, and they use a lot of natural materials in their showroom. Those
Yes.
big, heavy 300-pound tables, as Anne calls them. You know, that solidity in that table means that what's on it's important. So this neuroscience and neurodesign concepts that Apple uses is profound. I think their store in New York, which is so, you know, well known, the glass cube of Central Park, well, that's a 3x3 cube. You know, this is not an accident. This, you know, they know what they're doing. And what they are doing is creating an approach reaction. So you relax and you let go of your money. So it's, you know, it's profound. And Anne likes to talk about the car companies a lot. And they use this extensively. And look at the front of every car, it's a face.
Yep.
Back tends to be as well. And then you get inside and you look at the dashboard and there's a face looking right at you. So and you know, we should apply the same thing to architecture, and it'll create the kind of response that the car companies are getting and Apple is getting. But instead, we're building architecture that's an absolute free-for-all. There's no foundational understanding that we're affecting our biology potentially in a negative way. And I think that tends to be a problem for architects. If we have information that we're drawing buildings that don't support health and well-being, are we being negligent in pursuing ideas that in fact cause downregulation of our health?
Now, what are you seeing from your customers? Because you're the CEO of your architectural firm. Are more and more people craving and seeking out this type of neuro-aesthetic design?
You know, occasionally they will ask us about that. what they will come to us and say is, we've seen your work, it's beautiful, and we would like for you to work on our project. So what they're saying is that they're feeling a sense of rest and relaxation when they experience our work. And that's purposeful, because of many of the ideas that I've talked about today are embedded in our design.
Yeah. People who are watching this can go to rugglesmabe.com and check out some samples. It really is like it echoes of the traditional architecture, but with a very fresh spin on it.
Exactly. I think, you know, we have to be responsive to society, and there are forces, social forces, that people want to feel like they belong. So there are components to the design that need to be included that aren't necessarily from the 1800s, but you know, so that's a responsibility too, but also there's a responsibility to use ideas that will help their health and well-being. There's research now that this idea of rest and relaxation and homeostasis, you can actually affect the length of your DNA. They're called telomeres. It's a portion of the DNA strand right at the very end. And if that starts to die off, then they're showing that your life is actually shorter. So if you're creating stress and downregulated health and well-being, then it affects the telomeres, which actually affects the length of your life.
Wow.
So we tell our clients, so look, if you listen to us and let us guide you here, we can actually create an environment that's going to help you live a longer and healthier life.
That's incredible. I know there's a ton of interest online from not just people interested in health, but also longevity and the quality of your life. And you can see the growing popularity of people like Andrew Huberman, who are giving these breaking down the neuroscience so it's accessible to a wider audience. And there's such demand for it. And people need to start thinking about their built environment, their habitat, as one of these factors that will affect your health and longevity.
That's why I wrote my book, incidentally. I discovered the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, which is a remarkable organization in San Diego. The papers are pretty deep scientific papers, but I thought there was information here that the profession needs to be aware of. So I wrote the book, and my book has a lot of color photos in it and graphics, thanks to a brilliant artist named John Boak. And the feeling is, well, architects look at books, we don't necessarily read them because we're just so darn busy. So we wanted to tell the story graphically, but the purpose of the book is to bring these ideas to the fore so they could be distilled and easily embraced or discarded, depending on the professional. But, you know, present this information, because what the Academy is doing is pretty remarkable, and they're leading the way towards, you know, a new paradigm for architecture and design.
One thing I want to talk about, we've focused a lot on the appearance, the aesthetic side of this better school of thought when it comes to architecture. We touched lightly on material. For example, at the iPhone store, they have these big wooden tables that they feature their products on. Our hunter-gatherer minds associates the rich wood with value, so we're more willing to part with money to get these items that are on this rich, sumptuous table. But it's funny that we associate value with wood, and even not just an environment like a rundown kind of a ghetto or a strip mall or something like that. Even like the typical suburban area that we don't necessarily associate with ugliness. It's a lot of like vinyl siding, clapboards, asphalt shingles. I find the normal default habitat quite ugly, in fact. So I'm wondering if there's if what your firm is working on, or what the neuro-aesthetic school of thought is focusing on at all, is the materials that we use and how we put together these buildings.
So natural materials, stone, or tile with a tactile quality to it, wood, of course, even plaster, which alludes back to earth, if you will. So we're trying to utilize that. Materials, fabrics that have a tactile quality to it is really important. Coloration, the colors that we use are really important. And I think, our notion is create a parasympathetic backdrop for the clients, and then let the artwork and the sculpture or unique collections that they have be the sympathetic, curiosity provoking, exciting elements in the design. And again, it tends to be about 1/5 excitement and 4/5 parasympathetic, calm, restful, is where the brain relaxes. So think of a fashion show, you see in Paris, they have these remarkable, colorful, unique, odd, interesting, call it what you want, fashions, but what do they use as a backdrop? A classic old building, formed arches, stone, plaster, marble, soft light, all that is sending parasympathetic inputs to the attendee. And then they counteract that with exciting and unique and interesting, which is the fashion. So color is really important. Tactile is equally important. Olfactory, smell, super important. So if you have a beautiful room and it smells bad, you're not going to stay there, right?
Certainly not.
So that those are all cues that something's wrong. If it's a really rough surface, you reach over and it feels like a rose bush to you, that's alarming. That's sympathetic response. I need to get out of here. So, but we're, again, as mammals, we primarily process visually. So it's the visual that really resonates, and then you support the visual with tactile, olfactory, and auditory. So,
right. And so now that we have these patterns that the neuroscience, that the neuro-aesthetic research is providing us, it's interesting to know what we do with it. In your film, I believe it was Meredith Bonaziak had a really interesting point. She said, if we have these findings, will it lead to prescriptions that limit the architect's freedom to design? What do you think of that? Like, if we know how to optimize the health wellness response within an individual through our design, will that mean that it ties the hands of creativity on the architect's part?
no, I think it makes it a little more challenging, but we still get to be creative. Um, it's limitless, the possibilities of creating, a design that has a center to it and a proper left and a proper right, and bottom and top. I mean, look at the Barcelona Pavilion. That's a 3x3 composition that's been exploded. It's again, Calatrava's work. It's really good example. So that's part of the fun for the architects, is to solve the puzzle, but do it with this information that's going to make their clients' life better, not worse. So many projects I look at and I go, well, this is just an amorphous idea that's really unique and interesting, but there's no center to it. there's not one moment of repose that supports neurological processing. And oftentimes, they'll have a glass wall and look out to the yard. Well, that the view of the yard is definitely, relaxing. I mean, but that doesn't help the interior environment and the unsettledness that can happen if you don't give the occupants the ability to find what they're looking for. And that's part of our DNA is geometry that will support rest and relaxation.
Hmm. Now, I know you're not just a designer yourself and an architect, but you're also an educator. You present your findings to audiences. How receptive are other architects to these ideas?
Um, well, I think architects are generally just so busy,
Sure.
because they're overworked and underpaid. That I would say generally that response has been fairly low. On the other side of the equation, interior design profession is all over it. I can't give them enough information. And also urban planners too. They're completely open to receiving and embracing this information.
Hmm.
So I continue to talk to architectural groups, especially students. So I'm involved at the University of Colorado, Denver College of Architecture and Planning, and those students are coming to me all the time. And even though I have a reputation for traditional design, we do contemporary work as well. What I give to the students is this, embrace the lessons of the traditions, but use it to go forward in a real positive and innovative and creative way, and use the
Yes.
science. So it's balancing the two. Infuse the science into the old ideas that we've learned that do something for our health and well-being. So, and we have lots of students that come to us looking at that. I have a brilliant young research assistant, Natalie Ricci, that she's going to make her whole career out of utilizing this information. She went to graduate school, wrote her thesis on it, now is pursuing interior design to incorporate the ideas. And I think, young people recognize that there's information that they can use to make a difference.
Do you have any advice to young people who might be interested in pursuing an education in architecture or interior design or urbanism?
Well, so there's some really good books out that Anne Sussman's book is exceptionally good. I think Dr. Eric Kandel's book, he's a neuroscientist, The Age of Enlightenment. Anjan Chatterjee's book, neuroscientist from University of Pennsylvania. Nikos Salingros' book. You can go to my website, which is neuro-architectology.com under resources, and there's a book list there. So I think you've got to dive in and inform yourself about this new information. It's fascinating. Once you fall in the rabbit hole, you're not coming out. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. So I started in 2008, and I've got a pile of hundreds of books here that I've read and noted. It's pretty incredible.
Yes. I know online, like on Twitter or Instagram, there's so much interest in these aesthetic architecture, not just architecture, but cityscapes. People love Kyoto or Siena or Porto, all these places that, like we mentioned, tourists flock to. Those are the type of places that people like to share photos of. And then there's always the the commentary, why don't we build like this anymore? And then it's interesting because many of us, many of the people who are interested in this, we're not architects, we're not developers. What can normal people do to help promote more beautiful places?
Oh boy, that's a big question. I think
Yeah.
it starts with the education system. I think the new designers coming up need to be aware that need to be made aware that there's information that they need to look into and utilize in their work. Leon Creer is doing remarkable work, of course. I mean, he's the godfather of this whole thing. Not neuroscience, but he intuitively uses patterns that support this. And John Simpson and Robert Adam, name two, Elizabeth Pleiter-Zyberk, and in Miami, it's another one. So but I think it really rests on the students, and probably going to have to be self-educated, because I don't think a lot of the professors are embracing this. We're starting to see some response. I think we had an intern recently, and she's now at Syracuse as a freshman, but she presented this information to her professor, and the professor, grabbed onto it immediately, and starting to incorporate some of it into the classwork. So I think that, I believe that when people hear the information, they realize that, hey, this has some truth to it, and we should look at it. And it's not all that hard to embrace. It's just a paradigm shift that can be good for us.
We've covered a lot of ground today. Did we miss anything?
No, I think, I mentioned earlier homeostasis.
Yes.
Which is balance. And when we meditate, if those in your audience are, practice that, we're trying to achieve a certain brainwave. And you can achieve that same brainwave in a space if you use the right geometry. So literally, a room can create the same reaction as a meditation session. And the health benefits from meditation are well documented. So once you realize that the geometry and the space, the colors, the sound, the scent, the geometry, once those all work together and you're creating that proper brainwave response, you realize what the health benefits are, and it's pretty profound.
You'd wonder what type of civilization we could build if our environments were producing the same effect as a meditation session all the time, constantly.
I think things would be better.
Yes. Don, where can people find out more about your work?
Well, I would say the website that I mentioned earlier, which is neuro-architectology.com, and go to resources, and there's papers. Click on all, so look at all the papers. Those are papers from research associates from around the world. And then the movie is fun to watch, not hard science. It's fun and informative, and
narrated by Martha Stewart.
Yes,
she was wonderful in that. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't get to meet her. Our director worked with her, but she's a real pro for sure. Pretty amazing. We got her. So anyway, I would say just go to neuroarchitectology.com and start to dig around. It's It's a lot of fun. It's
Awesome.
it's nothing but interesting.
Yes,
So
very cool. Don, I think this is a good place to stop, although I'm sure we could go on and on. But thank you so much for speaking with me today.
absolutely. Thanks for having me. I was really honored to be with you.
Thank you so much. And for those watching at home, if you like this video, give it a like and subscribe and stay tuned for more. Thank you so much, guys. Take care.